Jose Baez, I think, was undersold as a lawyer, but also he might never have stood up in that courtroom, and the jury might have come back in the same way because the prosecution ultimately had the burden of proof. And it's been my experience that they take that instruction more seriously than any other. And so I think if we all took a deep breath, we might have been more prepared for this verdict and for the swiftness with which the jury came back.
Let me specifically, though, ask you about the child abuse, the aggravated child abuse charge, and not guilty on that. To Savannah's point, the first degree, a lot of people have been able to understand that. But when you look at the chloroform search and some of the other behavior, including the false information about Zanny the nanny having held this child away from her mother, what do you make of the not guilty specifically on that charge?
Well, still all on the same fact pattern and still not proved in court by prosecutors. I mean, really all that the prosecution had here and had very clearly were the false statements, the 31 days of not telling the truth and really leading everyone, and I think her parents too, on this horrifically false trail looking for this little girl. And whatever happened, there was no doubt that she violated the law in that way, and that's where the conviction came back. And I think the jury probably very quickly agreed on those counts as quickly as they did on the not guilties on the other. But that's where the entire prosecution case rested, on those 31 days of false statements and 31 days of behavior unbecoming a mother of a dead child. And that just wasn't enough for a jury to come back on aggravated child abuse or on murder.
If you had to zero in, and I hate to put it this way, but mistakes made by the prosecution, since the burden was with them, what mistakes do you think they made?
I think it was in overcharging the case. And this is a mistake made commonly by prosecutors in cases that aren't as high profile as this one. But perhaps had they charged the case differently from the get-go, they might have had a better chance of bringing this jury around. Now, it's always easy to look back, right? Monday morning quarterbacking, or I guess it's Tuesday afternoon quarterbacking. It's always easy to look back and say, oh, here's everything they should have done differently. And boy, wasn't the defense great, when just a week ago we were looking at the case very differently. So I don't want to be too critical. And even Jose Baez himself said at the microphone just a few minutes ago what an outstanding job he thought these lawyers did, and that he thought he was up against the best prosecution team he'd ever seen. So they were trying to seek justice in the name of this little girl, and they should not be questioned in terms of their motivations. But overcharging the case often does backfire.
Right now we stand at the same point we were an hour ago at 2:15 when we heard the verdict. We don't know how they came to this conclusion. No. What was the overriding set of circumstances, or what did they hear that connected more with the defense as opposed to the prosecution?
I love it when the jury talks, because we learn so much more about what went on in the course of the trial and in the jury room than we're ever going to learn otherwise. But like Savannah, I entirely respect their privacy. They do come out of the process on the day of the verdict very much a cohesive unit. Yeah. And then, as she says, they break down little by little over time. And eventually, I think with a case of this magnitude, we'll start to hear from them. I hope not in the form of book deals and screenplays, because
we've seen a lot of that. We have. I mean, we see that option a lot now.
Yeah, but I hope just in the form of reasoned interviews with people like you. And maybe we'll see that tomorrow or the next day. But I do think it's important. I know when I was a trial lawyer, I spent a lot of time talking to my clients about how they were to behave in court. And you didn't want a client who was too emotive, and you didn't want a client who was too stone-faced either. And you were very much aware, I was at least, of what my client was doing next to me in that chair.
Right.
Because you do worry that at least on some level the jury is paying attention to it. And I thought too much was made of Casey's demeanor. Here's how she behaves when the jury is present. Here's how she behaves when the jury isn't.
You both have legal backgrounds, but I did think that, are we focusing a little too much on this? And there were a lot of legal analysts who naturally, when we're looking for
that was not really legal analysis so much as psychoanalysis.
It's amazing, the reaction, and we were talking about this quite a bit off camera, the reaction in the community there, across Florida, across the country, and even internationally to this case. And it's really hard to understand why so much passion is engendered, mostly against Casey Anthony, but quite a a bit in her favor as well. A lot of it has to do with the digital age. People are really invested in the case online, on Twitter, on Facebook. There's a whole community that's grown up talking about this case online. I think a lot of the passion is because the child was missing, and for 31 days this mother took all of us on a wild goose chase, and she's admitted that much, and that's why she was convicted on those counts. And then everyone became emotionally invested in the case and found out they'd been lied to. And so right there she starts behind the 8 ball. And then, of course, the murder charges are filed. Now, but there is a real question about why this case, as the sheriff just suggested, and the state's attorney, why this case and not all of the other dead babies that are out there that don't create this kind of passion in the American public, and we'll probably never know the answer to that. I would just ask people to please respect the jurors and the process. As some people have been saying on Twitter today, we weren't in the jury room. Most of us weren't even in the courtroom. And so while it is easy to criticize their verdict, we have to respect what they've been through. This has been an intensely difficult process for them. They have to live with this verdict for the rest of their lives, much more so than any of us do. And so to threaten them or to question their verdict even, I think is terribly unfair.
Just about 1 minute left. Take us to the big picture, you know, between the Dominique Strauss-Kahn case, which has had a dramatic reversal in the same sense that everyone had sort of jumped to judgment about a character who may be unsavory but may not be guilty of what he was charged with. Is there some bigger constitutional lesson in this, Savannah, about the presumption of innocence that we should all, you know, a day after July 4th, take pride in somehow?
Well, I think we should take pride in the fact of our jury system, the fact that the prosecutors are put to their proof and have to put on a case beyond a reasonable doubt. And also just something for people to consider is what your notion and what your concept of justice is. Casey Anthony was acquitted in a court of law, but I wonder about the life she'll have from now. And I think about another verdict, what is it, 15 years ago, what people thought was a miscarriage of justice, O.J. Simpson, and think about what happened to him in the years that follow. So we'll just have to wait and see. I don't think this is the end of Casey Anthony's story.
I think in both cases the system seems to have worked in that prosecutors were able to pursue the truth, and in one case you have an acquittal, in the other case you have a probably dismissal when they can't make their case. But we have in both cases real efforts to prosecute by the facts being put forth in the medium. We have to be very, very careful as the public not to prosecute people in the press, but to wait for cases to be prosecuted in a court of law.
Let me bring Jami back in. Assess the defense attorney's performance, the defense team's performance. This was a fellow who was not a big, well-known defense attorney before, and I guess a lot of people were thinking that he had not done such a great job, but the results are the results.
You know, sometimes that's a good thing. You want the people's lawyer. You want an everyman in the courtroom. And the real question isn't whether Jose Baez connects with all of us. The question is whether he connects with the 12 people sitting in the box and the alternates. And clearly he did. The closing argument was very impactful. I wasn't in the courtroom, but by all accounts he connected with the jury, and clearly by the verdict he did too. He was also supported in this case by some of the finest lawyers in the country. Cheney Mason, Dorothy Sims. He knew to support.
And who are those folks?
They're very, very fine lawyers, death penalty lawyers, people who understand this kind of a case, who understand what's at stake, who understand how to try the case day in and day out. And you know, it's funny, when we cover a case like this, we tend to cover it in terms of wins and losses day by day. But you understand that in the end, all that matters is the verdict. And so I think Jose Baez was undersold in this case. He believed, I've interviewed him on several occasions. Many of the people who've been criticizing him have not. I'm here to tell you that he believed in the innocence of his client, not just that he could get a not guilty verdict, but in the innocence of his client. And a jury picks up on that. It makes all the difference in closing argument. That compassion comes through, and the jury really feels that, and they take that into the jury room. It's not more important than the evidence, but it's very, very important.
And do you agree with Jami's take on the defense lawyer?
Well, and I think I actually said earlier that he is an everyman lawyer, so we totally agree on that. And I think there's a Scottish verdict. It's called not proven. And that's really what this case is about. It's not that you're innocent necessarily, but the case is not proven beyond a reasonable doubt. I know Jose Baez, you know, he was very prepared. He was very ready with respect to the media. And he really did a nice job. He had the passion, and he believed in his case all the way along. And at the end of the day, he was gracious. Even when Jeff Ashton was supposedly laughing in court during closings, he still stood up and said, I don't want anything to happen to him. He apologizes. He's taken a high road, and he's come out of this with a very gracious, I think, press conference at the end of it, as did the prosecutors. But what an interesting day today, but not the OJ verdict. It's anything but. It just tells us the media doesn't have a burden of proof.
Now,
courtrooms do.
Now, Meg, I was watching a few minutes ago on our air when you saw the sheriff and you saw the elected prosecutor talking.
Right.
It was almost surreal because it's, with all the gracious thanks and congratulations to the team, it sounded like a victory lap, even though it's got to be the most stunning defeat in the most high-profile case of the decade. Is that just sort of the kabuki dance that they need to go through at this point?
I'm surprised they were so gracious. I mean, I don't even know why they came out, all of those people. I think Jeff Ashton and Linda Jane Burdick should have come out and thanked their staff for going through these days, all of these days of trial, day in, day out. They're the ones that deserve the thanks, even amongst everybody else. But it was interesting that they were so gracious and whatnot. And this really isn't like OJ at all. Remember, and it's been a while now, but remember with the OJ case, it's different set of circumstances, different set of facts. This case, on a legal standpoint, was not a strong case. The OJ case was just different. So, and also, that one's only 4 hours to return the verdict. They did deliberate, good 12, 13 hours here. So it's a big difference. And I really hope that everyone understands the evidence is what the jury listened to. That's it. And they had to weigh it and use it with the law. And in Florida, they were able to take their jury charges in with them so that it could compare the jury charges with the evidence. And that's why they came up with the verdict they came up with.
So, Jamie, the consensus emerging, this is not like OJ, even though millions of Americans seem to be, at least as best we can judge by the early reaction, feel like this is OJ.
The OJ analogy is utterly ridiculous. I covered the OJ case. I've covered all of the OJ cases. I don't know. I guess I should say I'm ashamed to admit every single one, every single day. It's a completely different case. As Ann suggests, it would take too long to go through all the reasons why here.
But take your word for it.
It's a completely different case in terms of the charges, in terms of the evidence. The only similarity is what? The verdict. And people don't like it because that was a not guilty verdict and this is a not guilty verdict. And that's the comparison that's being made. But everything else about the case is different. Look, what I have learned in all of my years of covering cases is that people sit in a courtroom and it's like the old adage about the blind men and the elephant. People see different things depending on their perspective, their point of view, their vantage point in the courtroom, and the jury sees it very differently as well. And so we have to be very, very careful when we assess what we think we've seen either in the courtroom or sitting at home watching on our television, or better yet, not watching at all, but we're just going to have an opinion anyway, right? And then when you talk to the jury, it always fascinates me that they have seen the case entirely differently from everyone else. It's amazing. And I'm sure when we hear from this jury, their opinion of Jose Baez will be different, their opinion of Casey will be different, their opinion of the prosecution will be quite different, and most of all, their opinion of the evidence will be entirely different from what we as a country have taken in over the course of the last 6 weeks. And so I do hope we will ultimately hear from the jury, because I think we will then perhaps have a lot more respect from this verdict, than we have had in the last few hours.
All right, Jamie, Ann, and Meg, thank you for that instant and incisive analysis.